Hello, my name is Vadim Spivak, and I'm a software engineer here at Google. And today I'm here to talk to you about a world beyond AJAX, accessing Google APIs from Flash and other non-JavaScript environments. And before we begin, there's a little announcement that I'm sure you've heard several times already, but I believe there's some comment cards somewhere in the room, either on your seat or around you, that they would like you to fill out after the talk is done. So to begin, we're going to start with a brief introduction of the APIs that will be presented during this talk. And they include the AJAX search, feed, and language APIs. And basically, the goals of this talk is to show you how easy it is to use the recently announced RESTful interface. And I'm going to go through actual examples or samples where the traditional JavaScript library that you might be used to doesn't fit very well. And a few examples of those are latency-sensitive applications, like mobile web apps where you really care about, the latency or the download size. Or if you have a predominantly big Flash or Silverlight application where you don't really want to have a JavaScript bridge, or you don't really have access to JavaScript because of the security model. And finally, if you want to make these requests from your server side instead of actually having the client make these requests, because you want to format the results slightly differently than the way we present them to you. So I'm going to go through the APIs one by one. There's only 3 of them, and hopefully quickly describe what they do for those of you who are not familiar with them. And we're going to start with the AJAX Search API. It consists of 7 different properties that you can see on google.com today, which are Google Web Search, Video, which includes YouTube, News Search, which is available through news.google.com, Image Search, Local Search, which you might be familiar with from Google Maps, Google Book Search, and finally Blog Search. So on the right side of the slide, I posted a simple hello world that literally takes about 7 or 8 lines of JavaScript code to embed on your website, and then you're going to immediately leverage the power of Google on your own site. For every one of these, there's actually a couple of advanced features I wanted to highlight briefly that some of you might not be familiar with. For instance, for image search, you can restrict the image results to faces only. So we have a face detection algorithm, and we can limit the results just to those. For web search, let's say you don't want to search the entire web, but you just want to search your website. And for some of you who have a lot of content, that basically makes you create a full text index. And then you might have to worry about how many queries the users do, and you might have to rate limit them and so on. Or you can just basically create a CSE, or a Google custom search engine, targeted to your website, and have us take care of the search problem for you. There's a couple other ones for instance, for local search, we recently announced KML search, which right now might not be very useful, but in the upcoming months we will definitely improve it. But basically you can search a collection of publicly available KML files and show them on your map. And again, the search API was actually launched about 2 years ago, and it's one of the most widely used APIs that Google has. And for each one of these APIs, I'm also going to go through a quick example of how you would traditionally use it in a JavaScript environment or normal browser model. So in this case, I have one of our most popular search API examples, which is called the video bar. You'd be surprised it's actually not a search component, but it's more of a little eye candy that you want to add to a blog or a website that you have. And what this example does is basically it searches YouTube. It selects the YouTube NBA channel. And it shows a quick sample of the 4 thumbnails for that channel. And you can click on any one of those thumbnails to play a video on that page. And again, it takes only about 4 or 5 lines of code. I omitted 2 script tags that you have to include on your site, but other than that, it's right there. So next, I want to highlight some of the, one of our most known customers to show you how they actually use the APIs. So starting with the bottom left, you can see the RollingStones.com website, and they use the the results, the search API to basically provide search on their website. Next, for some of you, I don't know how you booked your hotels or airfare, but basically Kayak is a really popular price comparison website, and they use Google Local Search through the AJAX Search API to provide local results on their map. And they actually use the Google bar solution for that, which is basically just one function call on the map object to enable the little search box on the bottom left. Finally, we have the time.com website, which some of you are probably familiar with. And they use our Google News API for displaying the most recently or most relevant news for each country in their global business section. And we actually have several other big customers. Many different Google properties also use the Search API. For instance, Orchid and Blogger have plenty of widgets that enable the users integrate some of these great solutions. So next in the family of the APIs we're presenting today are the Google AJAX Feed API. And it launched about a year ago, April of 2007. And initially when it launched, it just had one API call. It's a really simple API, just loading a feed. And a feed, again, is RSS or Atom. And we returned basically a parsed JSON representation of that feed. And for the people who actually need to use the raw XML results, we can pass that in as well. Next, about 6 months ago, we launched two different methods. Even though they sound similar, they have very different use cases. So it's find feed and lookup feed. Find feed basically lets you do a Google search or basically a discovery search for a feed for a particular keyword. So if you were interested in finding a feed about ESPN or NBA, for instance, you can easily enter that as a keyword, and you would get the most relevant feed that you would find for that particular keyword or a set of keywords. And then finally, we have lookup feed method, which is useful if you have a HTML page and you want to actually find the first related feed from that site. So you know what the HTML URL is, but you don't know the actual feed that's linked off that page. And this is useful in several cases, like Flickr, for instance, provides a very simple username for the users. And if you actually want to get to the feed URL, it has the user ID instead. So you can do a lookup feed on the Flickr page that's discoverable, and then you get automatically the user ID that was linked off that page. And I wanted to showcase some of the more popular solutions built on top of the feed API. So in the bottom right corner is probably the most common component that's used in many different use cases, and it's called the slideshow. And what it does is basically it pulls out the media RSS or any kind of thumbnail content from a feed. And again, you can program it to pull out, maybe the content section, or if you have some other namespace, you can configure it to do whatever you like. And it just basically creates a nice little slideshow component that transitions between the different thumbnails. And you can even see the little full control panel on the side that lets you basically manually transition through them. Next, on the left side of the slideshow, you can see a little, it's called the dynamic feed gadget, but basically it's a small little blog roll solution. And what it lets you do is specify a feed. In this case, the feed that we used was our Google AJAX Search API blog. And it will pull out all the headlines, or I guess in this case it just pulled out 4 or 5. And it will cycle through all the headlines, just showing a brief snippet for each one. It's very powerful for those of you who, if you have a static blog, or if you have a website and you just want to, link to some other content, and you don't constantly want to edit or use server-side include. You can easily do this on your website and include the content dynamically. And finally, we have a little hybrid that uses a little bit of both. So it's the People Top 5 Celebrities gadget. And it was actually built using the slideshow component on the left side that transitions and does all the same things that you would imagine slideshow does. But it also linked up to a little text control that cycles through the headlines for that particular celebrity. And of course, we always have to use Paris Hilton for our samples. So the actual code to write that slideshow is really trivial. And again, I omitted the 2 script tags you have to include, which is www.google.com/JSAPI. You can see it in all of our solutions. And basically the slideshow code itself. But other than that, you only have to add 4 lines of code, and you get this advanced solution on your site. Basically, in this case, we specify the feed. which is just a sample feed that we use for most of our samples. And we give it an ID element of the div where we want to insert the feed. And then we specify some advanced options, like we want the link to open in a new target blank window instead of in the current window. And we actually want to display the full control panel, which you can see right here. So for the feed API, it's definitely one of our other more popular APIs that we launched. And there's definitely a lot of use cases that you might have seen already. So in the top right, we have a little people gadget, which again is similar to the celebrity gadget, but this one actually cycles through a bunch of thumbnails. And when you click the thumbnail, it'll go to people.com and it'll play a video there. They really like this gadget and they use it for many different cases. SourceForge.com recently added a little blog roll, I guess, across all their networks that lets you read the more relevant news, from either ThinkGeek, SourceForge, Slashdot, and so on. Next, we have Partner Bar, which is, I don't know if you went to Mark's talk yesterday, but he talked about it in more detail. But basically, if you have a network of blogs, or you belong in a team sport or anywhere where you have a lot of partners, you can easily showcase them here. And this example or screenshot of Entertainment Weekly, where they want to promote CNN.com, AOL Television, and Yahoo Answers, for instance. Next is one of our more recent API launches. It's the Google AJAX Language API. And it's very simple to use. It only has two methods, both static JavaScript methods, I guess. And one of them lets you translate a language from whatever language you specify to a destination language. The source language is actually optional. So if you encounter some text and you don't know what the source language is, we'll do our best to detect it automatically and translate it into the destination language of your choice. The detect language method is basically, as it sounds, is you give it some source language, and we'll do our best to detect what the language is in. And we can do that automatically in the translate method call. And the screenshot I have here is of Dion, another Googler here, bookmarklet. And he showcased it in one of his talks yesterday. But basically, he created a bookmarklet for, I believe, Firefox and maybe a couple other browsers, where you can go to visit any site, select some text that you don't know because it's written in a different language, and just click the bookmarklet and it automatically will translate it to your language. So it's a really cool feature that doesn't actually require any site participation to use the API. So I don't really have a really good built-in solution or a sample to showcase, but I wanted to show how easy it is to actually use the API itself. Sorry. And basically, in this case, we have the Google Language Translate call. We pass in a hello world text string. We also give the source language, and again, this is optional. You can pass in either empty string or null. The target language is Spanish, or ES. And we provide a callback when the results are returned. And in this case, we just use the normal JavaScript alert prompt. And it once the method returns, well, we alert Hola Mundo, which is hello world in Spanish. And even though the language API is kind of new, it's about maybe a month or so, there's actually some really cool applications that have been built on top of it. Other than Dion's bookmarklet, there's a web application called Mibid.com, which is a web IRC, or a chat client. And you can actually join chat rooms and automatically translate whatever you type into a destination language. So if you join a Spanish chat room and you don't speak Spanish, everything you type will automatically be translated to Spanish. And on top of that, you can always translate whatever you receive also into your language. So, for instance, English. So it's a pretty cool application of the Google AJAX Language API. Okay, so going back to Flash and other non-JavaScript environments. We have basically the basic blocks of the Google AJAX APIs. All the three APIs I just talked about are built on the same blocks. So at the very low level, we have the RESTful data access layer. Right on top of it, we have our JavaScript library, or the JavaScript runtime layer. And on the very top, we have the JavaScript controls and UI elements like the slideshow, the dynamic feed gadget, and the search control. So the rest of this talk is actually going to focus on the very bottom layer, the RESTful data access layer. because the two layers above actually don't work on the server side or Flash and Silverlight and so on. So if you're actually interested in the two layers above, Derek is going to be giving a talk called Advanced Gadget and UI Development using Google AJAX APIs at 3:15 later on today in room 4. So feel free to visit if you're interested in those talks. So why did we, release or document the RESTful API? Well, basically, a lot of you or a lot of the customers have asked for a RESTful interface to the AJAX APIs. So we always listen to the customers, or we try to listen to you, and we documented the RESTful API, which are very helpful in the scenarios listed on the slide. So let's say you have a restricted or no access to JavaScript. And what do I mean by that? If you're writing an application, for instance, for the Facebook developer platform, you're very limited into the subset of the JavaScript language that you can use. I believe it's called FBJS. And in their case, they basically have a subset for security reasons, and our JavaScript runtime or the library that we provide just simply won't work. Or if you're, for instance, writing an application for MySpace before they launched open social support, the only thing you were limited to was basically a Flash movie. So a lot of people embedded slideshow components of their pictures and so on. In this case, we're basically opening up our search data and language, search feed and language APIs for use in those type of applications. Then, if you want to have tighter integration with your website, so our AJAX or our JavaScript runtime basically was implemented on without any frameworks in mind. So if you're already using jQuery, for instance, or Dojo, you might want to have a different way of accessing our JSON feeds. Or if you want to have more control over when the data gets loaded on your server, for instance, after a certain amount of clicks, our JavaScript library might not be the best fit for your website. And then finally, which I mentioned earlier, was basically the latency-sensitive applications. And I'm sure a lot of you are excited about the Android, and I'm sure some of you probably also played around with the iPhone SDK. And you really have to be careful with how much JavaScript or extra bandwidth or extra latency you encounter on the client side. And again, you probably saw in the keynotes yesterday that an extra 100 milliseconds might make a big difference in how happy the users are with your application. So for those use cases, you can actually access our RESTful data API directly without needing to download the actual JavaScript library and so on to use it. And some of those examples, I have a couple on there for basically writing a Flash or Silverlight app. You can use them directly from there. Facebook developer platform, and finally the two mobile examples, so the iPhone and Android. So let's briefly talk about the interface. The interface that we use is RESTful, so it's HTTP based. And all of our methods are actually read-only, so none of our APIs let you modify any user data. They're all basically using the public services that we provide. And as the actual payload for the RESTful interface, we use JSON. And the biggest reason why we use JSON is because our JavaScript library, which runs in the browser, can understand JSON pretty efficiently. But there are actually other advantages to using JSON. It's a very lightweight implementation. It's a pretty small standard. It's text-based, so it's easy to debug if you have some kind of problem. You can see what the actual response was in your browser by just copying and pasting the URL. It's very compact, so it's very useful on the mobile environment where you don't want to download extra XML tags and so on. And finally, it's very language independent in terms of, last time I checked on JSON.org, there were over 100 plus implementations for over 30 languages. So some languages have multiple implementations, or if you don't like the implementation on there, you can definitely write your own, and it shouldn't take that long since it's pretty small. So finally, let's dissect sample API request through the RESTful interface. So basically, this is a command line request of making a HTTP request using the curl command on the Linux prompt, or I guess most Unix command lines. And what we have here is basically the path itself. So in this case, we have ajax.googleapis.com/ajax/services/feed/load. The last two are the most important ones. So all the RESTful APIs that I just talked about have share the very first base common, and the last two things signify the API family name. So we have search, feed, and language. And then finally, and the last one is basically the resource you're trying to access. So for search, we have like web, news, web, and all the other ones I talked about. And to see the full list of these, I'll post the links to the documentation at the very end. But anyway, so we have the base path with the family name and the actual resource. And then every single API request that we have has a mandatory or required parameter, which is the V, standing for version. And the reason we have the version there is if there's some reason to make any changes to this, we want to make sure the protocol is versioned and we don't break any existing apps out there. Finally, we have the actual API request parameters. So these are specific to every type of request you make. And for the feed load API, we're actually going to be requesting the dig feed, and we only want to return one entry back. So now let's take a look at the output that you'll get when running this command on the command line. Every output that we return is basically a JSON object with 3 properties: response data, response details, and response status. Beginning with response data, we have basically for the feed request, we return a feed object with a bunch of JSON properties like title, link, entries, and so on. This is actually only a partial response because the whole thing wouldn't fit on the slide, but you can definitely get a good idea of what it looks like. Moving on to the next one, we have response details. And it's probably not the best name for this property, but basically this is the diagnostic string in case something goes wrong. And I'll explain that a little more with the next property. So response status is HTTP status code integer that will return describing the status of your request. So if you forgot, for instance, the version CGI argument, or you passed some bad combination of parameters or so on, we'll actually return like a 400 bad request, and it will populate the response details string with the information about why the request failed. And we will always try to return a JSON object, even if we can't serve the results. Okay, so the talk was titled Flash and Other Non-JavaScript Environments. And so we got halfway there for Flash in terms of having a RESTful interface. But if you really want to access this API from Flash, you need to have a cross-domain.xml file on our servers so you can actually make the request from your domain. So if we didn't have this file available on our servers, the only Flash applications that would be able to access our APIs would be the ones hosted on googleapis.com. But since we published this file, you can actually host your file anywhere you like on the web, and you don't have the user to click through any security prompts to access our APIs. And since Microsoft agreed on the standard as well, you can use this for Silverlight. So I briefly want to talk about the fine print for the APIs. For the RESTful interface, we would like you to specify a refer on these requests, because if the API is being used inside a browser, the browser does that automatically for you. If you make this request from server-side application, just a normal PHP script or so on, most likely it won't specify a refer for you. Then if you don't specify an optional API key, the request comes into our servers without any kind of identification except an IP address. And the problem is if you don't specify a refer or an API key, you might get automatically flagged and detected as like an abuser of the API. So we would suggest that you pass in the refer of where the API results are being displayed. But we understand that that's not always possible if you have a very AJAX-y app where, like Gmail, for instance, where the results might be displayed next to an email message. So then we just ask you to have like the refer set to your homepage in case we need to contact you about a bad use case or whatnot. And then finally, just some limitations about the APIs in general. The search API, for instance, only returns 32 results for each call. So you can only go up to 32 results for like the search API, for the web search or video search. And after that, we provide you a link on how to continue the search on the Google property. For language API, we limit you to only 500 characters of translation text. And then finally, for the feed API, we return up to 100 feed entries. But most of these limits for the applications that I showcased before are definitely not a problem, and a lot of people love using these solutions. Okay, so now we can actually get on to the fun part of the presentation, the examples that we built on top of the APIs itself. So I'm going to start off with a traditional AJAX example. So we're not really leaving the JavaScript model that far, but we're going to be using the JSON-P RESTful interface from the browser model. And you probably are familiar with some of this code if you used the APIs before, but let me just go through these really quickly and explain what's going on here. So we start out at the very top. We load the Google JavaScript loader. So basically, this is a script file that knows about all the APIs that Google provides. So this includes some of the APIs presented here, but also includes the Maps API, the GData API, and so on. Then on the next script tag, we basically load the feed API. And we use the loader to specify that we want the feed API with version 1. And we also have a utility to automatically set the document onload event handler. Basically, when the API is available, it'll fire that event. So we register the onload method, which gets called below when the API is ready to be used. And in this case, again, we load the dig feed using the google.feeds.feed constructor, or I guess JavaScript function. And we set another callback to basically specify when the feed actually gets loaded into the browser. And it gets fired right here. So if you look at the number of callbacks, so basically your document needs to be loaded. When the document is loaded, you basically create a feed object, and then you tell the feed, when you're loaded, fire off another callback. So there's 2 layers of callbacks. And again, this works for most of the examples that I've showcased before. So for a small number of sites, you really the way you measure the latency is sometimes called by measuring any changes above the fold of the browser. And what I mean by that is basically when you go to a page and you basically assume the page finished loading when everything that you see in front of you without scrolling is static or it doesn't move anymore. And the problem is if you use some of these controls like predominantly on the very, very top of your site, and it appears a second or so, or half a second even, after the page finished loading, it kind of creates like a jittery or a delay effect, and the users might not be very happy with it. Or it basically makes your site perceived to be slow when it's really not. And what you can do is actually use the DOM content loaded trick. And basically it's an event for some of the browsers like I believe Safari and Firefox. And for IE, there's a little trick that you can use to basically emulate the same event. And if you want to do that, basically the only thing you have to modify is add an optional parameter in the Google set on load callback function. And basically the second parameter used DOM content loaded is a Boolean, true or false. And then by default set to false if you don't provide one. And if you set to true, we'll try to make the API available even earlier than using the normal document onload event. However, even that provides a pretty slow interface because the DOM has to be completely parsed when the event fires. So one additional argument that I didn't mention earlier was basically our interface for JSON with padding, or JSON-P for short. And basically what we do here is we add an optional parameter, basically the callback. And what we do is we actually wrap the results with the callback that you provide. And you can access this before the DOM is ready, before the document is ready, and so on. You can do this as one of the first script tags that you embed on your site. And again, the result object looks identical to the one I showed before. This sample is, again, for the dig feed load. And one example is where this interface could also be very interesting is, for instance, if you use the jQuery JavaScript library, they have a really nice getJSON method, which I'll show you an example later, which basically you just provide the feed URL and then automatically it will create the callback for you. And then you don't even have to use the JavaScript library in that case, if you're already using jQuery. So let's take a look at the first example that I showed, which had 2 different callbacks and so on. So I just replaced it with defining a function called feedLoaded that returns a result object. And then I just added another script tag of basically inlining the whole request that I showed earlier. And what this does is basically, when the browser evaluates the contents of your HTML, it will see these 2 script tags. One will actually save the global feedLoaded function in the scope. And then next, it will evaluate the actual contents of the feed request while it's loading the whole page. And what you see is actually the results of the what's it called, of the API ready when the rest of your page is ready. And again, this is faster than onload or DOM content loaded. And it also saves a couple of requests and about 10 kilobytes of download size, because you no longer have to use our JavaScript runtime. One thing that I do want to stress here is that you have to be careful with what you do inside of the feed loaded callback, because if you use this before the DOM is ready, you might get some exceptions, especially in IE. You get an operation aborted if you try to access the DOM before it's ready. So make sure you know, for instance, in my example that I'll show you in the next slide, I use document.write to actually embed the contents of the results on the page. Okay, let me see if I can show these. So we have a small little blog sample right here. And basically, again, I just did this as a small little example. It's pretty straightforward, no actual dynamic content here, except that I have a little dig blog roll on the left side. Since I'm a big dig fan, I want to have the top popular headlines on the very left. And I don't know if you noticed when the page loaded, or I don't know if I refreshed it, but basically there's a small little delay of when they appear. And let me show you again what happens. Let me see if I can. So, and the problem with that is that basically we have a big image and a video on this page. So whenever you load this page, you see those images have to get loaded first, and then the document download fires. So next we have the example of basically using the use DOM content ready trick. And what it does is basically, again, uses the DOM content loaded event in Firefox and Safari and some little workaround in IE. And it should be almost instantaneous when it appears. But this DOM is very small for this example, so it's not a really good representation of what happens. But for instance, for the time.com site, we use the same trick where you would actually see almost like a half a second delay before the DOM is actually completely parsed into the browser. And then finally, we have the last example, which basically uses the document.write for embedding the dig blog roll on the site. And it should be instantaneous as soon as everything else loads. And let me see if I can briefly show you the source of what that looks like. So in here, basically, again, like I showed in the previous example, I have a feed-loaded callback. And I embed the static request right here. And then finally, when I actually want to use the results inside my span, I basically look at the dig feed result because it's been populated by this script tag right here. And then basically I create an HTML string or an array, and I finally do a document.write. And again, basically this is a very easy way of inlining the results really, really early in terms of the browser rendering. Okay, continuing with the results, or the demo, I guess. Next we have the news bar solution. And basically it's one of the most popular AJAX search APIs, or one of the most popular solutions built on the search APIs. And it provides a way of embedding news about a particular keyword on your site. And it's a really useful way of making your blog sticky by, let's say you do a blog post, or I don't know if you have just some kind of content on your site that you update on a weekly or maybe a monthly basis. You can easily provide a keyword or a set of keywords around that content, and then when the user visits your page, you can display the news relevant about that topic. So, for instance, if I have a blog about like the popular gaming consoles like PlayStation or Wii or Xbox, and I do a blog post every couple of like weeks or so, I can show the news about those relevant consoles, and then when the users visit my site, the site gets a lot more interesting for them because they can actually click out and see more relevant news about what they're interested in. However, the initial the news bar control was written in JavaScript, and one of the few requirements was, or some of the requests we had were, hey, can we add this to an application that we just have Flash access, like MySpace? up until they announced Open Social. And what basically we did, we took the newsbar component and we ported it to Flash. And in Flash, and especially ActionScript 3, Adobe provides a really nice interface for accessing web services. So it's using the HTTP service class provided with the SDK. Then we use the MXML for the layout script. And then finally, we have to use a JSON parser. So initially, when I mentioned there were over 100 plus implementations, one of them was for the ActionScript 3. And if you're still running Flash or Flex 2 SDK or Flex 1 SDK, they have appropriate libraries for that too. This is the CoreLib library hosted on Google Project Hosting or Code Hosting, and it's available as an open source form. So now I want to go again through the snippets. You might see a pattern of these snippets. Basically, we first initiate the request, and then finally we basically parse the JSON. And in this case, we use the HTTP service class. We basically set up the base path. In this case, we're going to be doing a new search for PlayStation, because I have a PlayStation blog. And again, we set up the required version argument. We specify the query that we were interested in. We specify the results are returned as text, since JSON is a text-based representation. And we basically set up the callback right here. When a callback fires, we get the data back as a string, and we use the JSON library to parse it into basically a ActionScript object. And in this case, I don't know if you remember when I mentioned that we have to pass in the refer. For a lot of these frameworks, like for instance ActionScript or the other one I'm going to be mentioning next, they actually set the refer for you automatically. So you don't have to worry about it in Flash. Let me see if I can get the demo working again. So in this case, oops. Let's see if I can get on here again. Okay, so in this case, I have exactly the same blog template as I had before. And the only difference is now I have a little, the news bar on the very top. And as you can see, let me see if I can pull this up on my monitor too. It's written in Flash. So basically, you can see the little Flash demo here. And it looks a little bit better because in Flash, you can do a little more fancy effects like rounded corners really simply by defining the border. And again, but everything else you've seen in the normal news control that we had, or news bar control we had before, are easily ported to Flash also. Okay. And then finally, we have our server-side example. And so for the server-side example, I try to come up with a nice little, use a little bit of everything. So I already used the AJAX news through the search API and the AJAX feed API. So now I want to showcase the Google AJAX language API. And then I'm sure a lot of you are excited about a Google App Engine. So I wanted to build an application that's hosted there. And then finally, I'm sure some of you are interested also in developing open social or Facebook apps. So I decided to play around with the Facebook developer platform to create a small little sample of what you can do using all these APIs. And what I came up with is basically using just a simple callback from the Facebook world of a wall, I think it's a wall attachment callback, to basically post wall messages in a different language than you usually write. And I'll show you how easy it is to use Google App Engine and the language API together. So when you use App Engine, today we have Python support. So basically, you can't make HTTP requests directly because of the security model, but you can use the URL fetch API provided in the SDK to make external HTTP requests. Next, to parse JSON, one of the more popular Python libraries is SimpleJSON, and I believe it's licensed very liberally. And finally, someone ported a really popular minimal Facebook developer platform library to Python and Google App Engine. And again, it's available under open source. And using these three combined, I can actually create a pretty powerful app in a matter of hours. So the actual example, again, this is the actual meat of the code. As you saw for the Flash example, I initialized the HTTP request. So in this case, I have the version argument, which again is required. Then basically for the query, I pass in actual text I want to translate. And finally, I have the language pair that I want to translate to and from. And like I said, initially the language API supports two types of mode of translating from language that you specify to a destination language, or we can automatically detect which language you enter. And usually you don't want to burden the users to enter two different text boxes, so it's nice if you can just have them enter the destination language. So in this case, we're not specifying anything for the source language, and we're just passing in the destination language. Then right below, we use the URL fetch API, which I just mentioned. And we just pass in the URL with all the CGI arguments filled in, and we get a response in line. Next, we use simple JSON to parse the results, and the results are returned in the response.content object in Python. And then finally, we do some error checking. And initially, when I showed the API request, I showed the two different properties in the very bottom, one being response status and response details. And this shows you how easy it is to use them. Basically, you check against the HTTP status code 200, which is OK. And if it's not OK, you can return a nice user message or user visible error. And ideally, you should probably log something for your own debugging of what the actual response details message was. But otherwise, you can just return the results directly to the user. And now I'm going to show you a quick little demo of what this looks like. So here I have, I'm logged into Facebook. This is actually my profile right here. So you can actually post messages, I guess, on your own profile as well. And when I set up my application, I just provided one URL, basically for the wall attachment callback. So now when I click on this little message, it pops up this UI. And again, the only thing I had to specify was basically these two text fields and a link for the preview. So I can say, hello from Google. And let's hope that this translates to something in Spanish. I guess now we have an error, but let me see if I can try something else. This is a test. Okay, so sometimes if you do auto language detection and there's not that many English words or words in a particular language, it's hard to basically identify what it is. And if you give it some more words or you actually have the user explicitly enter the source language, it works obviously much better. But in this case, I don't know if my connectivity is having issues, but let me see if I can try it again. So now you can see a nice little preview of what the message will look like before I click post. I click post on the profile. And then below, you should see a nice little message saying, this is a test in Spanish. And it has a nice little logo saying that it was translated using the AJAX API. Then so this comes to the end of the talk. And basically, if you're interested in any of the examples I showed, there's the full source code to the news bar, the blog examples, and the Facebook App Engine app on the URL below. And all the URLs and like CGI arguments are pretty well documented on our docs and are linked off their respective family API sites. And I guess if you have any questions, feel free to come up with the microphone and ask. Sure. Go ahead.
I've used the API, and it's great. I love the new feed API for RESTful. It's great. Now, one of the questions I have is, these feeds are changing all the time, and so one of the things we have to do is call that over and over and over again. Has it changed yet? Has it changed yet? And it seems to, be an obvious question of why don't we make this push instead of pull? Have you considered that, or are there any plans to provide those feeds on a push basis?
Well, I believe for these feeds, we actually use the Google Reader backend. So for all these APIs, we use another Google service to provide the results. And for Google Reader, we actually use a pinging service. And we also provide the results of the pinging service on our side, and I believe there's another third party that does it. So you can actually periodically, see if a feed has changed by just reading a bunch of, updates. And again, I'm not sure what your exact use case is. So if you're just looking at one feed and you're trying to see what the update is, or
yeah, looking at a small subset of feeds. From what I've seen on that list you're referring to, it's a huge change file where you can't really even open it and process it in that time because there's so many blogs and websites on the internet. So what I'm talking about is a small subset of here's 20 feeds I'm interested in. Let me know when.
Well, that's a really good suggestion. So currently we don't have support for that, but that's a definitely interesting part of the API that we'll consider.
Thanks.
Okay. I think that's it. Thank you.